Good evening, everybody. How are you? You're very good. Excellent. Right, it's my real great pleasure this evening to introduce to you Dr Joan Fitzpatrick, who has come to us from Loughborough University, where she's a senior lecturer. Joan works on Shakespeare things, but specifically Shakespeare and food. So she wrote the groundbreaking 2007 book, Food in Shakespeare. It's the first book really of it on that particular topic. And since then she's gone on to publish lots of other things. So she's published an edited edition of Three Sixteenth-Century Dietaries for Manchester University Press last year, and also a history of food and literature from the 14th century to the present. So we should be in for a feast. Terrible pun. Thank you for humouring me. So with that, I will hand it over to Joan. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm assuming people can hear me at the back because I don't usually use microphones, I simply shout. So as long as everyone can hear me, that's fine. Okay. Throughout this evening's talk, I'm going to ask you to imagine a world where seemingly strange statements about food and drink are true. My talk is structured around 4 sections and 5 peculiar ideas about food and drink in Shakespeare's time. Firstly, we'll look at fruit and vegetables. Then we'll turn to dairy produce. After that, we'll consider meat and fish. And finally, we'll move on to drinks. To begin with section 1 then, I'd like you to imagine a world where the following statement is true. Fruit and vegetables aren't very good for you, and you certainly ought to avoid eating too much of them. Given the repeated efforts of successive governments to encourage us to eat as much fruit and vegetables as possible, it's fascinating to consider what our early modern ancestors, including Shakespeare, thought about these foods. In the Renaissance, it was generally believed that before Noah's flood, human beings ate only fruit and vegetables, no animal flesh. In his dietary, Health's Improvement, first published in 1655, Thomas Moffat explains, "Before the flood, men were of stronger constitution, and vegetable fruits grew void of superfluous moisture. So by the flood, these were endued with weaker nourishment, and men made more subject to violent diseases and infirmities. Whereupon it was requisite, or rather necessary, such meat to be appointed for human nourishment, as was in substance and essence most like our own, and might with less loss and labour of natural heat be converted and transubstantiated into our flesh." Moffat here refers to vegetable fruits, but it was common for the early moderns to use the word fruit to refer to vegetable products in general. And I should point out that here I'll be referring to early modern dietaries, sometimes called regimens, throughout this evening's talk. Dietaries were mainly prose texts recommending what one should eat and why, and they played an important part in the cultural life of early modern people. We know that they were immensely popular and influential because many of them were reprinted several times. Now, these dietaries are an eclectic genre. Some contain recipes, and others give general advice about lifestyle choices, such as where to build your house. But they all offer the reader guidance on which foods to eat and why, and which foods ought to be avoided at all costs in order to maintain good health. The main point was to maintain an ideal balance of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, choler and melancholy, since an excess of one or more of these humours would cause illness. What you ate was an important means of adjusting the balance of the humours, so as to bring about an ideally proportioned mixture of the 4. The notion that fruit was full of water and could cause a harmful imbalance in the body if consumed comes up repeatedly in the early modern period. In 1612, another dietary author, William Vaughan, gives a detailed explanation of this view of fruit. All fruit, for the most part, are taken more for wantonness than for any nutritive or necessary good which they bring unto us. To verify this, let us but examine with the eye of reason what profit they cause when they are eaten after meals. Surely we must needs confess that such eating, which the French call dessert, is unnatural, being contrary to physic or diet. For commonly fruits are of a moist faculty, and therefore fitter to be taken before meals, but corrected with sugar or comforts, than after meals, and then also but very sparingly, lest their effects appear to our bodily repentance, which in women grow to be the green sickness, in men the morphew, or else some flatuous windy humour. Now, morphew was a leprous or scaly condition of the skin, and as Gordon Williams has indicated, green sickness was an anemic disease commonly attributed to a virgin's sexual fantasies, which were made manifest through an unhealthy pallor and could only be cured by a sexual encounter. That fruit was denounced by the dietaries and other authorities does not mean that it was not regularly eaten. It was sold in the streets and in markets at home and abroad. The poor would have eaten fruit growing wild on bushes and in hedgerows, and excavations of the Rose Theatre in London indicate that a wide variety of fresh and dried fruit was consumed during performances. Although wild apples, pears, plums and woodland strawberries had been grown in England for hundreds of years, the early modern period saw new fruits from southern Europe introduced into the gardens of the wealthy and thence into their diet. For example, apricots, melons, pomegranates, oranges and lemons. Pumpkins were considered especially watery. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, Mistress Ford describes Falstaff as this unwholesome humidity, this gross watery pumpkin. Pumpkin seeds were also found in the excavation of the Rose and Globe playhouses, and so it's possible that the fruit itself, or the seeds, were consumed by wealthier members of the audience. In dried form, fruits such as raisins, currants, prunes, figs and dates were also imported in large quantities to serve the luxury market. In the writings of Shakespeare and his contemporaries, a distinct suspicion towards fruit in general is consistent with advice from early modern dietaries that fruit should be consumed with caution and in moderation. I'm going to begin by looking at the apricot before moving on to a few other fruits that tell us quite a bit about Renaissance attitudes to diet, the body and health. It's thought that Henry VIII's gardener, the Frenchman John Wolfe, introduced the apricot to England in 1529, although the climate was not especially favourable to their cultivation. John Gerard, in his Herbal, or General History of Plants, claims that the apricot tree grew in many gentlemen's gardens, including his own. So this is despite the climate not being very good for growing apricot trees. As the agricultural historian Joan Thirsk pointed out, in England, apricots were acclimatised in gardens in the 16th century by being planted against sheltering walls, since on standard trees the apricots did not always ripen. It's presumably the fruit growing against sheltered walls that dietary authors have in mind when they repeatedly note that the fruit is quick to ripen and therefore quick to rot. This may have added to the sense that the apricot caused dietary ailments, specifically amongst women. As we've just seen, the dietary author William Vaughan thought all fruit capable of provoking green sickness in women. In Health's Improvement, Thomas Moffat described apricots as plums, dissembled under a peach's coat, good only and commendable for their taste and fragrant smell, their flesh quickly corrupting and degenerating into colour and wayish excrements, engendering pestilent agues, stopping the liver and spleen, breeding ill juice, and giving either none or very weak nourishment. But he also notes that they are medicinable and wholesome for some persons, for they provoke urine, quench thirst, and syrup made of the infusion of dried apricots qualifies the burning heat and rage of fevers. They are least hurtful to the stomach and most comfortable to the brain and heart, which be sweet-kernelled, big and fragrant. In a herbal first published in 1568, William Turner cites Galen, the most influential ancient authority on medicine in the early modern period, and Turner warns that apricots must not be eaten after a main meal, for they rot and are corrupted while they swim above other meats. And if they be taken after meat, they corrupt both themselves and all other meats that are near unto them. Of course, the word meat was often used by the early moderns to refer to food in general, not just animal flesh, in the same way that the word fruit could refer to all vegetable products. In King Lear, the fool refers to cutting the egg in the middle and eating up the meat, meaning the food inside the shell. In Diet's Dry Dinner, published in 1599, Henry Butts notes that apricots quench thirst, wet the stomach, and that the kernel kills worms, but also that the fruit tends to inflate the stomach, soon corrupt, possess the blood with much water, and make it soon putrefy. Apricots are mentioned by Shakespeare in two plays, A Midsummer Night's Dream and Richard II. In Dream, Titania instructs her fairies to tend to the recently transformed bottom by feeding him with apricots and dewberries, with purple grapes, green figs and mulberries, and honey bags stolen from the humble bees. The combination of sweet tastes and smells emphasising the sensory pleasure to be had from such foods. This excess of fruit would have struck the dietary authors as quite dangerous. You'll remember William Vaughan's warning from his 1612 dietary that fruit should be consumed very sparingly, lest their effects appear to our bodily repentance. In Shakespeare's Richard II, the gardener instructs one of his men, "Go bind them up, young dangling apricots, which, like unruly children, make their sires stoop with oppression of their prodigal weight. Give some supportance to the bending twigs." This instruction provokes a comparison between law and form and due proportion, kept in the garden, and the land, England itself, which under Richard's governance is full of weeds. Perhaps Shakespeare chose apricots rather than some other fruit or vegetable to provoke the comparison because of the fruit's reputation as one that was quick to rot and soon corrupt, as Henry Butts puts it in his 1599 dietary, suggesting allusion by Shakespeare to Richard's own situation and the corruption of the kingdom. Apricots seem to have been especially associated with female ailments. In his Dietary Health's Improvement, Thomas Moffat says of apricots, "Let not women eat many of them," without specifying why. which is very helpful of him, really. Henry Butts's point, the point he makes in Diet's Dry Dinner, that they inflate the stomach, might merely suggest wind, of course, or reinforce an association between apricots and pregnancy. In John Webster's play, The Duchess of Malfi, the Duchess is given apricots by Bosola, which she greedily eats, and they confirm her pregnancy when she suddenly goes into labour. An association between apricots and pregnancy suggests a sexual dimension to Titania's relationship with Bottom. And it's not unusual for productions to exploit this sexual dimension by showing Titania and Bottom writhing on stage in a manner that suggests they are engaged in sexual intercourse. This next slide doesn't show that, you'll be relieved to know, but it does show that their relationship is unmistakably sexual. It's pretty unmistakable. Certain vegetables were also associated with sex in the period. Some dietaries urge caution when consuming parsnips and carrots because they were thought to provoke lust. A belief perhaps partly due to the phallic shape of these vegetables. Parsnips are briefly mentioned in the play Sir Thomas More, when, in a scene probably written by Shakespeare, Londoners complain about foreigners bringing disease-ridden vegetables into the city. They bring in strange roots, which is merely to the undoing of poor apprentices, for what's a sorry parsnip to a good heart? Trash, trash. They breed sore eyes, and 'tis enough to infect the city with the palsy. Nay, it has infected it with the palsy, for these bastards of dung, as you know they grow in dung, have infected us, and it is our infection will make the city shake, which partly comes through the eating of parsnips. Carrots make only an indirect appearance in Shakespeare, when Mistress Quickly mistakes Evans's Latin carrot for carrot. Remember, William, vocative is carrot. This is teaching Latin, and Mistress Quickly says, and that's a good root. She misinterprets, she believes that he means a carrot. Sexual innuendo occurs a few moments later when Mistress Quickly confuses the genitive case plural, horum, harem, horum, with the word whore. Another vegetable thought to provoke lechery was the onion. The dietary author Andrew Board warned that onions doth provoke a man to venerous acts. And in Chaucer's general prologue, the summoner, who is described as lecherous as a sparrow, is said to eat them. Well loved he garlic, onions and eager leeks. The dietary author William Vaughan claimed that onions clarify the voice, which might explain why actors would want to eat them before a performance, despite being warned against this by Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream, who tells the mechanicals, and most dear actors, eat no onions nor garlic, for we are to utter sweet breath, and I do not doubt but to hear them say, it is a sweet comedy. Now, a fruit that is mentioned several times in Shakespeare is the prune, or dried plum. Stewed prunes were often served in brothels, which were known as stews. And stewed prunes come up in a number of plays. In Henry IV, Part 1, Falstaff argues with the hostess over money and tells her, there's no more faith in thee than in a stewed prune. In Henry IV, Part 2, Doll ridicules Pistol's claim to be a captain. He a captain? Hang him, rogue. He lives upon mouldy stewed prunes and dried cakes. And in Measure for Measure, the pregnant wife of Elbow, the constable, enters a brothel looking for stewed prunes. Stewed prunes were perhaps popular in brothels because they were thought to protect against disease. The term could also suggest a brothel whore or even testicles. That term, stewed prunes. Shakespeare refers to a number of fruits that we no longer ordinarily consume, and varieties since lost to us. For example, apple johns, quinces, and medlars. The apple john was a variety of apple best eaten when overripe. And in Henry IV, Part 1, Falstaff describes himself as withered like an old apple john. The medlar was also eaten when overripe or rotten, because it was otherwise too hard to consume. And you'll see that another name for the medlar was the open arse, due to the fruit's wide but puckered circular extremity. I do apologise, but it was the name that they called it. I mean, you can see, I think, from this picture where the name came from. Incidentally, I would advise against searching the internet for this term. So you might get some surprises that you had not expected, so I would really not do that. In Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio makes fun of Romeo's love for Rosaline. If love be blind, love cannot hit the mark. Now will he sit under a medlar tree and wish his mistress were that kind of fruit as maids call medlars when they laugh alone. Oh, Romeo, that she were, oh, that she were, an open arse, and now a pop-brimmed pear. You see, it's Shakespeare, I've not made this up. Shakespeare actually uses these terms. Romeo, good night, I'll to my truckle bed, this field bed is too cold for me to sleep. Come, shall we go? Mercutio here clearly refers to the medlar, or open arse, in a sexual sense. And Eric Partridge suggested that his reference to the pear is also bawdy, since it sounds like pop her in. Get it? Pop her in. And the pear was shaped like male genitals, apparently. Numerous varieties of apples, peaches, pears, and plums available during Shakespeare's time are either lost or mostly unfamiliar to the modern consumer. Sweet lemons were a variety available in the 16th century that we no longer grow. Dried white peas were the standard pea variety before being displaced by green peas. And the rhubarb found in modern kitchens is different from the one known by Shakespeare. When Macbeth asks the doctor who has attended his wife what rhubarb cyme or what purgative drug would scar these English hence, hearest thou of them, he is referring to a common drug made from the dried root of a plant related to modern rhubarb and used to treat choler. And the rhubarb with which we are familiar was introduced to Europe from Asia in the 17th century. It didn't become a common food until around the year 1800. Now, figs were believed to cause less harm than other fruits, but it was generally understood that they caused lice. Figs were also thought to protect against poison, which is ironic since they also had the reputation as a vehicle for poison, so for causing poison, presumably due to the fact that many figs were imported from Spain and Italy, the homes of untrustworthy Catholic foreigners. In The Noble Spanish Soldier, a play probably by Thomas Dekker, the king is poisoned by a Spanish fig. A Spanish fig is also mentioned by Flaminio in John Webster's The White Devil, when he tells a Bracciano, I look now for a Spanish fig or an Italian salad daily, meaning he expects to be poisoned any day now. In Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 2, Pistol visits Falstaff with news that their former companion, Prince Harry, is now King Henry V. Sir John, thy tender lambkin now is king. Harry V's the man, I speak the truth. When Pistol lies, do this, and fig me like the bragging Spaniard. Pistol is presumably here making an obscene gesture. To give a person the fig meant thrusting the thumb between two of the closed fingers, so doing that to give someone a fig, very rude, or into the mouth, something like that, we think. It implies that, in this context, fig suggests penis, or even turd, or female genitalia. Pistol's fig me could mean either F me, F-U-C-K me, or more likely, I could have said the word, but in these surroundings I didn't feel it was appropriate. So he could be saying F me, or more likely, given the reference to the Spaniard, he could be saying poison me, which would be considered fit punishment for the bragging Spaniard. It's rude, whatever is going on here. In Henry V, also, Pistol refers to figs in his argument with Fluellen, who has refused Pistol's request to intervene with Exeter on behalf of Bardolph, sentenced to death for stealing from a church. Die and be damned, and fico for thy friendship. It is well, the fig of Spain. Very good. I say the fig, within thy bowels and thy dirty maw. Fico is Spanish for fig. The fig of Spain was a poisoned fig, also known as the Spanish fico, or an Italian fico. Pistol's reference to the fig and Fluellen's bowels might be explained not only by the fruit's shape, but by its laxative properties. So it's shaped like a turd. I'll say the word. It's shaped like a turd, a fig. Now, the curious belief that figs engender lice might be explained simply by the fruit's association with excrement, although other fruits were also believed to cause lice when eaten in excess. They had some very strange beliefs in some ways. For example, blackberries were another fruit that they thought would engender lice if eaten to excess, but the lice probably indicates corrupt blood. So eating these fruits to excess would corrupt the blood and therefore engender lice. Of course, Pistol also has an unfortunate encounter with a leek in Henry V, when, having made fun of Fluellen, the Welshman, who's wearing a leek in his hat, he's punished by being beaten and force-fed a raw leek. It's quite appropriate, given there were leeks for dinner tonight, weren't there? Leeks and cheese. By Jesu, I will make him eat some part of my leek, or I will beat his pate 4 days and 4 nights. I won't do the Welsh accent, but the funny spelling is because he's speaking with a Welsh accent. Bite, I pray you, it's good for your green wound and your bloody coxcomb. Must I bite? Yes, certainly, and out of doubt, and out of question too, and ambiguities. By this leek, I will most horribly revenge. I eat and eat, I swear. This scene makes more sense to a modern playgoer if we understand that in Shakespeare's time they believed that raw leeks were especially harmful to health. For example, the dietary author Thomas Cogan claimed, "Their nourishment is naught. They hurt the eyes and engender black melancholy blood and cause terrible dreams. They hurt the sinews through their sharpness, they hurt the teeth and gums, and choleric and melancholy folks should not use to eat them, and especially raw. Yet if they be boiled and eaten with honey, they cause one to spit out easily the phlegm which is in the breast, and open and ease the lungs." Now, I asked you at the beginning of this talk to imagine a world where fruit was considered pretty bad for you. This is also a world where human breast milk is the best you can get. But you might also drink almond milk, that is, milk made from almonds and water. Milk was from the food group commonly known as white meats, a term that we usually apply today to light-coloured meat such as poultry or veal. William Bullen is typical of the dietary authors in advocating the consumption of human milk by adults as well as children, claiming that women's milk is the best milk that helpeth against consumptions. And William Vaughan also described it as the wholesomest and purest milk because it is restorative medicine for the brain and the consumption. When we realise that human breast milk was recommended for consumption by adults as well as children in Shakespeare's time, references to milk and milkiness in the plays begin to make more sense. For example, having learnt of the witches' prophecies, Lady Macbeth echoes their demonic incantations in her invocation to the powers of darkness. Come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers, wherever in your sightless substances you wait on nature's mischief. Come thick night and pall thee in the dunnest smoke of hell, that my keen knife see not the wound it makes, nor heaven peep through the blanket of the dark to cry, hold, hold. It's not entirely clear whether Lady Macbeth desires the murdering ministers to nourish themselves with her milk, which has turned to gall, or to take away her milk and put gall in its place, as suggested by Samuel Johnson, but either meaning locates Lady Macbeth as unnatural. Milk is also used to indicate cowardice in the play. After reading the letter sent to her by her husband, telling her of the witch's prophecy, Lady Macbeth says of her husband, "Yet I do fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. Thou wouldst be great, art not without ambition, but without the illness should attend it." Like Lady Macbeth, Goneril in King Lear criticises her husband Albany when he expresses concern at her treatment of Lear. "This milky gentleness and course of yours, though I condemn not, yet under pardon, you are much more tasked for want of wisdom than praised for harmful mildness." Milk was considered to be cooling. Henry Butts, noting that milk is cold and moist, warns, "Eat no more milk than you can well digest, though it seemeth to be soft and easy meat, fit for children and milksops, yet it is not so. Use no violence after it, nor drink wine, afore you feel it thoroughly decocted." Lady Macbeth and Goneril want their husbands to be more aggressive, more masculine, but are suggesting that it is precisely because their men are milksops, full of milk, that they are not fierce. That milk was often advocated as a food for the weak and sick suggests that, as far as their wives are concerned, Macbeth and Albany are pretty feeble. Almond milk, made from ground almonds and water, was a well-known substitute for milk in Renaissance England, and we still drink almond milk. It's become fashionable today as well. It lasted longer than real milk, and it was often used in recipes from the period. As Alison Sim pointed out in her book, Food and Feast in Tudor England, for most people, milk was a precious resource, not least because their cows did not yield as much milk as cows do today, and milk was needed for making cheese and butter, two essentials of everyday life. The whey left over from making cheese was all that was likely to be left for drinking for most people. Now, we've already seen that the early moderns inhabited a world where fruit was not very good for you and human breast milk was the best kind of milk you could drink. This was also a world where butter and cheese suggest distinct national stereotypes. Butter, like all dairy produce, was usually produced by women, termed butter women. Many dietary authors focus on the nationality of those who eat butter. Andrew Board recommends that butter be eaten in the morning before other meats, noting that French men will eat it after meat, and Dutch men doth eat it at all times in the day. So too in his Government of Health, William Bullen claims that the Flemings are little troubled with colic because they eat much butter. The playwright Ben Jonson enjoys drawing connections between the Dutch and butter eating. In his play Volpone, Mosca observes, "You shall have some will swallow a melting air as glibly as your Dutch will pills of butter and ne'er purgebird." In Johnson's play Bartholomew Fair, Quarles compares the Falstaffian Ursula, she's a rather large lady, and he compares her to a quagmire or a bog, that if a man were to sink into, 'twere like falling into a whole shower of butter. They had need be a team of Dutch men should draw him out. In a 1690 treatise on brewing, Thomas Tryon compared people not willing to pay more than usual for good beer to the ignorant Irishman who prefers his stinking butter of as many colours as the rainbow over wholesome, sweet English butter, which he counts hath no taste in it. And it seems that the Irish preserved their butter in bogs, a practice that apparently affected the taste as well as the colour. Like the dietary authors, Shakespeare engages with a range of cultural stereotypes when, in The Merry Wives of Windsor, Master Ford, thinking his wife has been unfaithful with Falstaff, claims, "I will rather trust a Fleming with my butter, Parson Hugh the Welshman with my cheese, an Irishman with my aqua vitae bottle, or a thief to walk my ambling gelding than my wife with herself." In Shakespeare, most of the references to butter are made by or about Falstaff. The fat knight is several times compared to butter by himself and others. And in The Merry Wives of Windsor, Falstaff calls Ford, unwittingly to his face, a mechanical salt butter rogue, suggesting that he is so mean and cheap he will buy imported salted butter rather than the fresh English stuff. In Shakespeare's time, cheese was especially associated with the Welsh. And in Merry Wives, the Welshman Sir Hugh Evans conforms to stereotype by looking forward to a dessert of cheese. "I will make an end of my dinner. There's pippins and cheese to come." Pippins, a variety of apple, were considered difficult to digest, especially if eaten raw. So cheese, renowned for closing the stomach, would make an appropriate accompaniment to them as a final course. When Sir John Falstaff is tricked into dressing up as Herne the Hunter and pinched by children disguised as fairies, he responds to Evans directing them with, "God defend me from that Welsh fairy, lest he transform me to a piece of cheese." As Joan Thirsk pointed out in her book, Food in Early Modern England, cheese was traditionally a food for the poor, specifically peasants. But after 1600, it became more fashionable. And this was especially true of hard, long-maturing cheeses that cost more. And a taste developed among the rich for fancy cheeses, especially if they were brought from far away. Thomas Coriat was a much celebrated figure in early modern England, who gained fame by publishing accounts of his travels across Europe and Asia. And there he is on an elephant, riding an elephant. And in his travels, he made lots of notes. He gathered together lots of notes on the various countries he visited, on the people, their customs, and their foods. And Coriat did not like what is apparently Parmesan cheese, I observed a custom in many towns and cities of Italy, which did not a little displease me, that most of their best meats, which come to the table, are sprinkled with cheese, which I love not so well as the Welshmen do, whereby I was oftentimes constrained to lose my share of much good fare, to my discontentment. So poor old Coriat's obviously very hungry, but they're sprinkling everything with parmesan, and he can't enjoy anything to eat. Incidentally, Thomas Coriat seems to have been amongst the first early modern Englishmen to use a fork. Forks weren't used in England, even by those who considered themselves fashionable, until the 17th century. And even then, their use was not widespread. Coriat brought a fork home from Italy, where its use was commonplace, and he was teased mercilessly by his English friends for using this fork instead of his fingers and a spoon to eat with. So I've asked you to imagine this evening a world where fruit is not very good for you, women's milk is the best you can get, and other white meats invoke national stereotypes. Imagine also in this strange world that meat is far better for you than fish, which should be avoided if at all possible. Fish was generally considered inferior to meat because it was thought to be less nourishing. Fish days, implemented for economic reasons to encourage the fishing industry and bring down the high price of meat, were apparently unpopular. For many Protestants, eating fish was associated with Catholicism, specifically the practice of abstaining from meat on Fridays. In Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 2, Falstaff criticises Prince John for eating many fish meals, thus suggesting that he is weak. Denouncing Prince John for eating fish would be in keeping with the historical figure upon whom Sir John Falstaff was apparently based, the proto-Protestant martyr, Sir John Oldcastle. In King Lear, the disguised Kent says to Lear, "I do profess to be no less than I seem, to serve him truly that will put me in trust, to love him that is honest, to converse with him that is wise and says little, to fear judgment, to fight when I cannot choose, and to eat no fish." As Stanley Wells pointed out in his edition of King Lear, the reference to eating no fish is self-deflatingly anticlimactic, but might also suggest that Kent is a loyal Protestant who does not fast on Fridays. The standard early modern view appears to have been that eating meat was divinely ordained and more healthy than a vegetarian diet, although there were lots of factors to be taken into consideration before consuming it, including whether or not a specific meat was suited to one's humour or complexion, occupation, and even nationality. For example, bacon was thought fitting only for labourers or those involved in physical activity because it was considered difficult to digest. As the food historian Ken Albala pointed out, chicken was universally praised as the healthiest food for people of all complexions, all ages and regions. Now, chicken was also specifically recommended by some as a food for the sick. For example, the dietary author William Vaughan regarded chicken fitter to be eaten of sick men than of them that be in health. But chicken was very expensive in Shakespeare's time, so only the wealthy would have eaten chicken, with most people keeping chickens for their eggs. In Shakespeare, capons are an indulgence. They are a favourite of Sir John Falstaff, and in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, Launce's dog, Crab, steals a capon leg from Sylvia's table. In Shakespeare's time, there seems to have existed two contrasting traditions concerning beef. On the one hand, beef was thought to stir up courage, something emphasised by classical philosophers and evident in Henry V, when the French constable says of the English soldiers, "Give them great meals of beef and iron and steel. They will eat like wolves and fight like devils." On the other hand, it was believed that beef caused stupidity. Shakespeare twice refers to beef in this sense. In Twelfth Night, Andrew Aguecheek observes, "I am a great eater of beef, and I believe that does harm to my wit." And in Troilus and Cressida, Ajax calls Thersites a mongrel beef-witted lord. As Robert Applebaum has pointed out, although hot English stomachs were thought better suited to digesting a cold and gross meat like beef, part of the wit of Sir Andrew's remark is that by Shakespeare's time, beef was not considered as good as it once was, and Sir Andrew thus fails in his ambition to be a man of fashion. Now, this painting by Hogarth is about 150 years after Shakespeare and comes at the height of a long-standing association between England, the English, and beef. The fashionable and the wealthy would have eaten venison, strictly the flesh of deer, but also used in Shakespeare's time, that word venison, to refer to the flesh of any animal killed by hunting and used as food, which could include boar, hare, rabbit, and other game animals. Shakespeare seems to have been generally sympathetic towards hunted animals in his writings. In As You Like It, Duke Senior expresses reservations about hunting. "Come, shall we go and kill us venison? And yet it irks me, the poor dappled fools, being native burghers of this desert city, should in their own confines with forked heads have their round haunches gored." In The Winter's Tale, moments after we see Antigonus exit pursued by a bear, the old shepherd enters, complaining about the behaviour of the young. I would there were no age between 10 and 3 and 20, or that youth would sleep out the rest, for there is nothing in the between but getting wenches with child, wronging the ancientry, stealing, fighting. Hark you now, would any but these boiled brains of 19 and 22 hunt this weather? They have scared away 2 of my best sheep, which I fear the wolf will sooner find than the master. Here hunting is depicted as antisocial, and our sympathy lies with the shepherd, who, like Corin in As You Like It, tends animals as opposed to slaughtering them. The only other hunter in the play, The Winter's Tale, is the bear, who pursues and eats Antigones, a rather nice inversion of the usual scenario. And we are told that the bear is hungry, and that's why he's hunting. Now, this world that I've asked you to imagine, where fruit isn't very good for you, breast milk is the best you can drink, and meat is better than fish, is also a world where you shouldn't really drink water, but rather stick to beer, ale, or wine. In Shakespeare's day, water was not considered especially healthy, and the advice was to approach its consumption with care, avoiding stagnant or very cold water. As the historian Peter Clark pointed out, beer and ale were safe alternatives to water, which was increasingly suspect, particularly in towns, as a result of deteriorating sanitation caused by population increase. When water is drunk in Shakespeare, asceticism is usually evoked. For example, Timon of Athens serves his unfaithful friends stones and lukewarm water, a contrast to the rich food and wine they have previously enjoyed. Most people drank small ale or small beer, which was very weak. And that's what small beer means. It means weak beer. Even children would have drunk very, very, very weak beer. When Shakespeare refers to beer, he usually refers specifically to small beer. For example, in Henry IV, Part 2, when Prince Harry asks Poins, "Doth it not show vilely in me to desire small beer?" When the witches in Macbeth gather around their cauldron and chant, "Double, double, toil and trouble," they might well be alluding to contemporary brewing practices. Double beer was especially strong, so called because it was boiled twice. And double beer was stronger still. In his History of English Ale and Beer, H.A. Monckton tells us that Queen Elizabeth, in the second year of her reign, complained that the brewers had ceased brewing single beer, but brewed instead a kind of very strong beer, calling the same double beer, which they do commonly utter and sell at a very great and excessive price. She ordered that the practice of brewing double beer should stop, and that the proper prices be observed. She also made it clear that brewers should brew each week as much single as double beer, and more. Elizabeth's government were aware that double could cause toil and trouble, since drunkenness and the threat it posed to public order was of real concern in the period. It's nothing new. In the 16th century, the increasing popularity of beer made with hops and the brewing expertise of Flemish immigrants meant that ale soon came to be regarded as old-fashioned. So beer made from hops begins to take over from the old-fashioned ale without hops. In 1547, Andrew Board argues that ale for an Englishman is a natural drink, and he disapproves of the foreign beverage beer that now of late days is much used in England to the detriment of many Englishmen. Women brewers, known as brewsters, dominated ale production in medieval England, just as women dominated the manufacture of dairy products, but were gradually sidelined as brewing, and particularly the brewing of beer, was taken over by men. Alewives had a bad reputation, not least for watering down the customer's ale. And here's a detail from a medieval painting of the Last Judgement, also known as the Coventry Doom, showing alewives amongst the souls of the damned. They took their ale drinking very seriously. In Shakespeare's play The Taming of the Shrew, Christopher Sly, insisting that he is not a lord but a tinker, says, "Ask Marian Hackett, the fat alewife of Wincot, if she knows me not." According to G.R. Hibbard in his edition of Shrew, Shakespeare might have had a particular alewife in mind. The woman referred to here may well have been a real person, since Sarah, the daughter of Robert Hackett, was baptised in Quinton Church on the 21st of November 1591. The hamlet of Wincot, 4 miles south of Stratford, lay partly in the parish of Quinton and partly in that of Clifford Chambers. Perhaps Marian Hackett was Robert Hackett's wife and Sarah's mother. Shakespeare makes several references to ale and the alehouse, and generally they are synonymous with drunkenness and bad behaviour. In Twelfth Night, Malvolio admonishes Sir Toby and Sir Andrew Aguecheek for their drunken singing. "Do you make an alehouse of my lady's house, that ye squeak out your cosier catches without any mitigation or remorse of voice? Is there no respect of place, persons, nor time in you?" In Henry V, Gower imagines Pistol boasting of his military feats among foaming bottles and ale-washed wits. And Doll insults Pistol, "Away, you bottle ale rascal, you basket hilt steel juggler you." As Alison Sim pointed out in her book Food and Feast in Tudor England, hops made beer a very different drink from the ale it replaced. Hops acted as a preservative, so while most ales had not lasted long, beer could keep for months. Despite the disapproval of early writers such as Andrew Board, beer was considered healthy when consumed in moderation. Since it was regularly drunk, it was regarded primarily not as a drink but as a food, providing calories, nutrients and vitamin B.